February 10, 1945, near Kleve, Germany, Operation Veritable. The forest is dying. Every branch drips with thawing frost and smoke. The wind carries the dull, rhythmic percussion of artillery, distant yet constant, like a heartbeat that refuses to stop. Snowmelt turns the ground into a thick, sucking mud that swallows boots, shells, and men alike. The Rhine is only 20 miles away, but for the soldiers of the Allied 2nd Armored Battalion, it might as well be another world. Captain Daniel Mercer leans forward inside his Sherman Firefly, eyes fixed through a narrow slit of glass already veined with grime and ice. The sky above is a flat, colorless sheet, neither day nor night, the kind of light that bleeds hope out of a man. Around him, the forest has become a labyrinth of shattered trees and broken armor, a graveyard of what once moved and breathed. He checks his watch. 0540 hours. The order was clear. Advance through the Reichswald, link with the infantry column from the 15th Scottish Division, and hold until the engineers clear the road behind them. But the order had come 12 hours too late. The Germans, dug in, desperate and hidden, had already sealed the lowlands with mines and mortar fire. In the distance, through the mist, comes the rumble of something heavy. Mercer listens. He knows the difference, the sharp diesel growl of their Shermans and the guttural thunder of a tiger. The latter carries weight in the air, a sound that thickens your pulse. His gunner, Corporal Hayes, glances up from the periscope. Movement at 11 o'clock, Cap. Mercer doesn't answer. He doesn't have to. The entire crew knows what that sound means. They've been outflanked. The historian's voice would later say, by dawn on February 10th, 3 Allied units, 1 armored, 2 infantry, found themselves trapped in a shallow basin north of Kleve. German counterattacks from the high ground threatened to cut off their route to the Rhine. Communications had failed. Fog, mud, and broken command lines turned the battlefield into a blind chessboard. But inside Mercer's tank, history doesn't feel like history. It feels like heat and fear and the smell of burning oil. Through the slit, he sees flashes, muzzle fire between the trees, the flicker of tracer rounds weaving through mist like angry fireflies. Somewhere to his right, an American half-track burns. A shape crawls out of it, screaming, one arm trailing uselessly. Mercer bites down hard, forcing his mind to stay on the map folded across his knee. There's no time to help, no time to think. Just a rough pencil line pointing north toward an open ridge that's already under German range. The radio crackles. Able 2, this is Able 6. Where the hell are you? We've lost sight of Charlie Company. We're taking fire from both flanks. Mercer lifts the handset. Static. Then silence. He knows what's coming next. The cutoff, the panic, the confusion. It's how encirclements begin. First you lose the voice on the other end, then you lose the road, then the light. Outside, the smoke thickens, rolling low across the ground. It's not Allied. It's German artillery, white phosphorus, smoldering as it creeps through the frost. Mercer's driver coughs, eyes watering. They're blanketing the woods, sir. I know. He watches the way it moves, slow, deliberate, like the hand of something unseen closing in. And in that moment, a thought sparks. Not from training, not from orders, from instinct. He remembers a manual he once read, a paragraph buried deep in the Tank Corps handbook, about how smoke can disorient artillery spotters if used in high humidity. It wasn't meant for offensive use. In fact, the last line of that section had been clear. Unauthorized deployment of dense smoke screens during active engagement is strictly prohibited. Mercer stares out at the creeping fog. Unauthorized. He taps his helmet. Load smoke. Hayes hesitates. Sir, orders were. I said load smoke. The loader fumbles with the canisters, cylindrical, heavy, marked with faded yellow paint. When the first one slides into the chamber, the tank feels suddenly heavier, quieter, like the air itself is holding its breath. Fire. The cannon thunders. A plume of dense white vapor erupts forward, merging with the German smoke until friend and foe blur into one suffocating veil. Mercer orders another round, then another. Soon the entire ridge is swallowed. To the north, infantrymen huddled in shallow trenches watch in disbelief as their world turns to cloud. The German gunners hesitate. They can no longer see their targets, no longer track movement. Confusion spreads through their ranks like frost through glass. And beneath that confusion, through that thin window of chaos, Mercer moves. He calls out coordinates over the short-range frequency, voice calm, clipped. All units able to move, fall back through grid 9. Use the smoke as cover. Repeat, use the smoke. No acknowledgement. But he knows they heard him. Through the white blur, shadowy shapes begin to emerge. Infantry crawling, dragging wounded, clutching rifles above their heads. The tank engines whine as they reverse through mud, treads slipping, exhaust burning through the haze. From above, the scene looks unreal, as if the forest itself is breathing. In the historian's later words, for 6 minutes, visibility across the basin dropped to less than 10 meters. German artillery ceased fire, believing they had struck their own front line. In that gap, 3 Allied companies withdrew to higher ground. The smoke tactic, though unauthorized, altered the shape of the battle. But inside the tank, 6 minutes feels like eternity. Mercer grips the radio handset, knuckles white. Keep moving, keep moving. The Firefly lurches backward, steel grinding against stone. The driver curses as the left tread catches, the engine choking on mud. Hayes slams the periscope sideways. We're blind, Cap. Good, Mercer mutters. So are they. A shell screams past, close enough to rattle the bolts. The air inside the tank turns sharp, metallic, electric. Then silence again. When the smoke finally begins to thin, the forest re-emerges, ghostly, hollow. In the distance, the German guns are quiet. The ridge that once burned with tracer fire now lies still, blanketed in pale mist and silence. By 0730, the remnants of 3 Allied units regroup on the far side of the basin. Of the 60 men who entered the forest before dawn, 41 make it out alive. Mud-soaked, deaf, eyes red from smoke, they stagger toward the clearing where the engineers have finally broken through the roadblock. Captain Mercer stands beside his tank, helmet off, hair matted with sweat and frost. The morning light filters through the trees, faint, gray, indifferent. He doesn't smile. He doesn't speak. He simply watches the men file past, one after another, faces blank, shoulders heavy. He knows they'll call it luck or coincidence or confusion in enemy ranks. He won't correct them. He can't. Because what he did wasn't in the manual. It wasn't in the plan. It was unauthorized. But it worked. Later, a field report will note only this. Second armored elements successfully withdrew under cover of heavy smoke. Losses mitigated. No mention of Captain Mercer. No mention of how close they came or how the smoke turned day into survival. He didn't know it then, but that moment, that small act of disobedience, would echo far beyond the forest of Kleve. Somewhere in those clouds of smoke, a new kind of courage was born. Not the courage to fight, but the courage to act when no one else would. And though history would move on, to the Rhine, to the victory parades, to peace, the forest would remember. The mud would remember. The smoke, rising like a ghost in the gray February air, would remember. Because sometimes, the tactics that save lives are the ones no one ever writes down. Escalation. Morning in the Reichswald feels like the aftermath of the world ending. The snow, once white, is now a slurry of soot and blood. Tank treads have carved deep scars through the forest floor, and the air hums with the metallic echo of engines idling in fear. The 2nd Armored Battalion's forward elements, what's left of them, have dug into a shallow defensive perimeter behind a narrow tree-line. It isn't much, just enough to delay, not enough to hold. Fog curls low and heavy, the kind that muffles the sound of boots but amplifies the sound of breathing. Captain Daniel Mercer leans over a field map spread on the back of his tank. The ink has begun to bleed from moisture. Around him, his men move quietly, cleaning machine guns, patching radio cables, whispering to each other in voices that sound smaller than the forest itself. The withdrawal under smoke had worked. 3 units, his armor, a company of Scots infantry and a recon platoon, had escaped total encirclement. But they're not safe. Not yet. They've traded one trap for another. The German 116th Panzer Division still holds the high ground east of Kleve. Recon reports suggest they're repositioning, forming a wedge for another push. And the Allied air cover that once dominated the skies? Grounded. Fog. Always the fog. Mercer checks his watch. 0835 hours. They have 4 hours before the next artillery bombardment. 4 hours to decide whether to move or dig in. 4 hours to outthink an enemy that's already watching. He lifts his binoculars. Through a break in the smoke, he can see the ridge, blackened trees, broken stone, the faint movement of silhouettes through the haze. The Germans are close. Too close. Beside him, Sergeant Walt Hensley crouches low, clutching a radio handset with frostbitten fingers. "Command still out of range, sir," Hensley mutters. "Lines are a mess. Wires cut somewhere back near the engineers." Mercer nods, expression unreadable. "Then we'll improvise." Hensley exhales through cracked lips. "That's what got us this far." By late morning, February 10, 1945, communication across the Kleve sector had collapsed. The terrain, waterlogged, mined and cratered, had turned radios unreliable. Command decisions fell to whoever could still see through the fog. In this case, that was Captain Daniel Mercer. Confrontation. The forest grows restless. A distant thump rolls across the basin. Then another. Then a chorus. The German counter-battery has found them. Shells begin to fall with terrifying precision, each one closer than the last. The ground convulses with every hit, throwing up mud and shrapnel in equal measure. Men dive into shallow foxholes, clutching helmets, praying the next shell finds someone else. Inside Mercer's Sherman, everything rattles. The periscope flickers, instruments dancing under concussive force. The driver, a kid barely 20, shouts over the noise. "They've got our ranged cap." Mercer's eyes flick to the compass. The barrage isn't random, it's tightening, walking in a pattern. They're boxing them again. He grabs the radio. Able 6 to all call signs, move 10 degrees west, now. Static. Then silence. The realization hits him hard. The smoke tactic worked too well. The retreating units had fallen back into scattered sectors. No unified command, no shared signal. Just fragments of survivors clinging to the idea of formation. And through that fractured line the Germans are coming. Through the periscope slit, Mercer sees movement, dark figures weaving through the trees. Panzer Grenadiers. Hundreds of them. Advancing in disciplined silence, rifles slung low, their gray coats blending with the ash and frost. "Hayes," he calls to his gunner. "High explosive. Load fast." The round slides home. "On my mark." The first German squad breaks into the open. Mercer exhales once, steady, and speaks the word that turns thought into thunder. "Fire." The cannon booms. A shell arcs through fog and detonates among the trees. The shockwave ripples through the forest, flinging bark, snow, and men into the air. But for every squad that falls, another appears. They keep coming. Within minutes, the ridge becomes a rolling storm of fire and smoke. Sherman turrets twist, machine guns spit tracers, and infantry hunker behind the tanks for cover. Radio chatter dissolves into chaos, half codes, half screams. Ammo running low. "Medic. We need a medic." They're flanking from the east. Mercer wipes mud from his goggles and scans the left flank. He sees it, the gap forming between his armor and the Scottish infantry. The Germans see it too. If they break through there, the entire line will collapse. He jumps down from the tank, boots sinking to the ankle in muck. The cold bites instantly through his gloves. Hensley shouts after him, but Mercer doesn't turn. He moves through the chaos, shouting orders, waving his arms toward the infantry sergeant manning the flank. "Pull your men 10 meters left, close that gap." The man nods, barely audible over the gunfire. A mortar explodes nearby, throwing Mercer into the mud. His ears ring, the world reduced to static and flashes of light. When he opens his eyes, the sky is spinning. And then, through the ringing, comes a sound that doesn't belong. Something deep, mechanical, deliberate. A tank engine. But not theirs. He looks up. Through the smoke and fire, a shadow moves, massive, angular, predatory. The silhouette of a Tiger Eye tank crawling through the fog, gun barrel sweeping like an accusing finger. "Christ almighty," he breathes. The Firefly's main gun is capable of piercing a Tiger's armor, but only from the flank or rear. Face to face, it's suicide. He scrambles back to his tank, mud slick beneath him. Hayes opens the hatch as Mercer climbs in, breathing hard. "Tiger ahead," Mercer says. Hayes swears. "Range? Too damn close." The Tiger fires first. The shell slams into a nearby Sherman, tearing it open like paper. Flames erupt, men scream, the turret lifts clear off its hull. The shockwave hits Mercer's tank, rocking it sideways. He grips the intercom. "Driver, reverse, 40 yards, angle left." The Firefly lurches backward, gears grinding. "Gunner, load AP." "Loaded." "Hold, steady." The Tiger turns its gun, searching for the source of the movement. Smoke curls around its hull, obscuring its cross. For a split second, its side armor flashes into view. Fire. The Firefly's gun erupts. The round streaks across the gap and slams into the Tiger's flank. A bright orange bloom fills the fog. The Tiger halts, then explodes in a burst of black fire, turret lifting clear, smoke pouring out like a dying breath. The crew inside cheers, but Mercer doesn't. He just watches. Because he knows there's never only one. German Tiger units operated in pairs or threes, using the first to draw fire. For every Tiger destroyed, another was usually waiting just beyond the tree line. The next one appears seconds later, firing blind through the smoke. The round hits near the infantry line, scattering men and dirt. Mercer's heart hammers. He knows they can't hold. Not without something drastic. Then he remembers the smoke. He opens the side compartment, eyes on the canisters marked SMK-60. Only 4 left. "Hayes," he says quietly, "we're doing it again." The gunner hesitates. "Sir, the last time we—" "I know. Load it." The loader slams the first canister into the chamber. Mercer flips the radio switch. "All units, deploy smoke." "No. All of it." No response. "Doesn't matter." He fires. The cannon roars, belching thick, white vapor that spreads across the battlefield. Within minutes, the entire tree line vanishes in fog. Visibility drops to nothing. The Germans, confident moments ago, now falter. Their commanders shout, voices echoing in confusion. The wind shifts, dragging the smoke across the ridge, twisting friend and foe together. Inside the haze, Mercer makes his move. "Driver, forward." Slow. The Firefly inches through mud, guided by instinct more than sight. The turret sweeps left and right, ready for ghosts. Hayes grips the firing lever, sweat running down his neck despite the cold. Suddenly, a dark shape looms through the mist, too close, too large. The Tiger's hull. "Fire." Mercer shouts. The cannon detonates. The shell punches into the Tiger's lower glassy plate. A moment later, fire erupts through its hatches. The explosion sends a shockwave that clears the fog for an instant, long enough to see what's left. 2 Tigers burning. The line holding. The Germans retreating in confusion. Resolution. By afternoon, the smoke begins to lift. The forest is unrecognizable, cratered, charred, and eerily still. Mercer climbs out of the turret, boots slipping on the tank's steel surface. He pulls off his helmet, letting the damp air sting his scalp. Around him, medics move through the wreckage, carrying stretchers, checking pulses that aren't there. He sees faces, young, blank, exhausted. Men who've survived something they don't yet understand. Hensley approaches, limping, arm in a sling. "Command finally got through," he says. "They're pulling us back. Reinforcements are pushing the ridge tomorrow." Mercer nods. "Good." Hensley hesitates. "They asked who authorized the smoke deployment." Mercer looks away. "Tell them it was weather." They share a silence, half relief, half disbelief. In the distance, the sky begins to change. The fog, for the first time in days, thins enough to reveal the faint shimmer of sunlight. It lands on the steel hulls, the mud, the helmets, turning everything silver. Mercer watches it for a long time. The sound of artillery has faded. Only the wind remains. That day, the unauthorized smoke maneuver not only saved 3 units from encirclement, it disrupted the German counterattack across the entire Kleve sector. Operation Veritable continued, opening the path to the Rhine within weeks. Captain Mercer's name appeared nowhere in the official dispatches. But those who were there, who saw the smoke rise and felt the silence that followed, never forgot. In the end, history remembers the victories. But sometimes what truly turns the tide are the seconds of defiance no one ever writes down. February 11, 1945, the morning after. The snow fell again that night. Not heavy, just enough to mute the battlefield. By dawn, the forest north of Kleve lay still, every crater softened, every blackened tree draped in white. The smoke that had once turned day to nightmare had drifted east, leaving behind a silence too wide to name. Captain Daniel Mercer stood beside his tank, the same Firefly that had carried him through the fog, and looked out over the ridge they had fought so hard to hold. Beneath the snow, the ground steamed faintly from the heat of spent shells. Broken rifles lay half buried in the mud like fossils of the previous day's madness. Of the 3 units that had escaped the encirclement, 41 men were accounted for. 41 from nearly 200. Mercer counted them in his head, not as numbers but as faces. The quiet Scotsman who'd carried a radio twice his size. The young gunner who'd sung softly in the turret to keep his hands from shaking. The medic who'd gone missing in the fog and reappeared hours later, guiding 2 wounded men with his arms over their shoulders. They were all fragments of the same miracle, survivors of something no one would ever fully understand. Behind him, a jeep rattled up the slope. Out stepped a major from division headquarters, crisp uniform beneath a layer of dust. He saluted without warmth. "Captain Mercer," he said, voice clipped. "I'm to take your report." Mercer nodded, wordless. He handed over a notepad, brief, factual, detached. Enemy counterattack repelled. Position held. Allied forces regrouped under cover of smoke. Minimal armor loss. No mention of the disobedience that had saved them. No mention of the moment he'd chosen instinct over instruction. The major flipped through the pages, frowned slightly, and tucked them into his coat. Unorthodox use of smoke, I'm told. Mercer didn't reply. The man looked at him for a moment longer, perhaps expecting justification, perhaps respect, then walked away, boots crunching over frost. When the sound faded, Mercer was alone again. He climbed onto the Firefly's hull and sat there, the cold biting through his uniform. Somewhere beyond the trees, artillery rumbled, not nearby, but near enough to remind him the war hadn't ended. Not yet. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind slide through the shattered forest, carrying with it the faint scent of oil and pine. For the first time in weeks he let himself breathe. Aftermath. The success of the withdrawal near Kleve allowed Allied forces to reform their line and maintain momentum toward the Rhine. Within 3 weeks, British and Canadian troops would cross into German heartland. Operation Veritable achieved its objective, but at immense cost. More than 15,000 Allied casualties. The battlefields of the Reichswald would remain a scar long after the snow melted. Mercer's battalion received a unit citation for valor under fire. His commanding officer mentioned exceptional adaptability in combat. But the line that followed buried the truth. Tactics employed unverified due to communication loss. No medal. No reprimand. Just silence. He didn't mind. For him, the recognition was in the 41 who walked away from that basin alive. In the fact that, for one more day, the world had tilted toward mercy instead of chaos. When the war finally ended 3 months later, Mercer returned home to Manchester. The newspapers carried photographs of flags, parades, generals and open cars. None of them showed the mud or the fog, or the faces of men watching smoke curl from the barrels of their own survival. He married quietly. Took work as a railway engineer. The rhythm of pistons and steam soothed something in him, the mechanical heart of motion that had once kept him alive. He never spoke about the war in public. When his children asked, he'd say only, "It was cold. It was loud. We did what we had to." But sometimes, on winter mornings, he would stand by the window when fog rolled in over the rooftops. He would watch it move, slow, silent, white, and his eyes would narrow as if recognizing an old friend. The historian's reflection. In archives decades later, among thousands of field reports, one page stands out: 2nd Armored Battalion, February 1945. The handwriting is neat, the language spare. There is no mention of heroism, no flourish of emotion. Just coordinates, weather, and a single note in the margin. Smoke cover effective beyond expectation. That was all. Historians piece together the rest from testimonies of soldiers who were there. The Scots infantrymen who swore they saw the forest itself rise and swallow the Germans. The radio operator who insisted the smoke saved them more than any tank ever could. One of them, interviewed in 1972, said, "I remember thinking the smoke was punishment at first, couldn't see, couldn't breathe. But then we realized we were still alive. That's when I knew someone somewhere had done something they weren't supposed to. God bless the man who did." There was no photograph of Mercer that day. Only the outline of his tank, barely visible in a reconnaissance image, a single dark shape in a sea of white. That image, blown up and hung in a museum decades later, bears the caption, "Unnamed Sherman, Operation Veritable. Used smoke to conceal Allied withdrawal." Visitors walk past it every day, glancing briefly before moving on to the next exhibit. They don't know that inside that tank was a man who defied an order to save lives. A man whose decision altered the shape of a battle, and whose name history quietly misplaced. Legacy. Some legacies roar in brass bands and speeches. Others whisper through the years like wind through old forests. Captain Daniel Mercer's legacy is not carved on stone or printed in textbooks. It lives in the silence between orders, in every soldier who has ever paused and thought, what if the manual is wrong? His unauthorized smoke tactic would later inspire changes in Allied and NATO doctrines on battlefield concealment. What began as an act of improvisation became procedure, tested, codified, and taught to generations of armored officers who would never know the name of the man who first broke the rule. But beyond tactics, his act carried something rarer: moral courage. The courage to decide that survival sometimes demands disobedience. That humanity does not always align with hierarchy. That saving lives is its own command. In a post-war lecture on leadership, a retired general once said, "The battlefield rewards clarity, but it is mercy that defines command." He never mentioned Mercer, but he might as well have. The return. In the spring of 1963, nearly 20 years after Kleve, Mercer returned to Europe with a veterans delegation. The forest had regrown by then, tall birches and pines masking the wounds beneath. The ground still rippled with the shapes of old craters, softened by moss. He walked the ridge where the smoke had rolled all those years ago. The air smelled of rain and soil, not cordite. Birds nested in the branches of trees that had once been splintered by shellfire. He stopped at a clearing where he remembered standing knee-deep in mud, shouting orders into static. There was no monument, no marker, nothing to suggest that history had paused there once. He knelt, pressed his hand to the earth and whispered, "Still here." The wind moved gently through the grass, almost like an answer. Documentary narration, closing. Every war produces stories that fade between the lines of victory and loss. Some men are remembered for what they destroyed. Others for what they saved. Captain Daniel Mercer never sought recognition. His smoke screens, improvised under fire, changed the course of a battle and the fate of 3 isolated units. His reward was survival, his punishment silence. But perhaps that is the truest kind of valor, the kind that leaves no trace but the lives it preserves. When the Rhine was finally crossed and the world declared the war over, the forest of Kleve went quiet again. And in that quiet, if you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the hiss of smoke rolling through the trees, the breath of defiance that turned darkness into shelter. Epilogue. In 1989, when Mercer passed away at 71, his daughter found an old wooden box among his belongings. Inside were no medals, no commendations. Only a small black and white photograph, the tank half hidden in fog, and a note in his handwriting. It was never about winning. It was about getting them home. That note now sits in a museum archive, beside the faded field report and a rusted smoke canister labeled SMK-60. Together they form a quiet memorial, not to conquest but to compassion under fire. Some men fight wars with bullets. Some fight them with silence. Some, like Captain Daniel Mercer, fight them with smoke, and faith that doing the right thing is worth the cost of being wrong. History may not remember his name, but the world he helped save still breathes because, for one impossible morning in February 1945, a man looked into the fog and chose to act. Sometimes the path that saves everything is the one you were never meant to take.